If you're in the Northern Hemisphere like I am, hi buddy. The winter days are getting shorter, and that means gardening season will be coming up soon enough. So I'm going to show you how to get your shears in tip-top shape so that they're ready for the season. There is nothing more frustrating than having to work hard for no reason, simply because your shears are dull. So let's talk about what you need to do to get them ready for the season. So first of all, you want to get them clean. And one thing that's really important is that you want to clean them after every use. You don't want to leave any of the residue that's stuck to your shears after working in the garden. You don't want to leave that on there, because what that does is that traps moisture and dirt and will accelerate rusting of the tools. So every time you use them, give them a good wipe. If there's some stubborn stuff, a little bit of hot water and soap might help. And because this is a beginning of year thorough cleanup, I'm going to take these apart and we're going to consider what are the things you can do to really give them a good cleaning. So as you can see here, I have a wire brush. Now, I specifically chose brass, not steel, because brass is soft. The blade on your tool is going to be steel, which is harder than brass. And so that's why I recommend you use brass, because it won't scratch the steel. When you're using that to rub off any residue, try to avoid scratching the actual edge of the blade. Because the edge of the blade is so thin, even though it's steel, which is harder than brass, you can still wear it down if you rub that thin edge with the brush. Because this is a gardening tool, when you're shearing small branches, things like that, we're going to have a combination of things. We're going to have lignin, and we're going to have cellulose and hemicellulose. Those are all pretty durable substances. They're not easy to break down. So I'm going to use a combination of friction with, as I talked about, the brush, as well as a solvent. Turpentine is what I chose as the solvent. I decided on turpentine because turpentine, first of all, it comes from basically shredded up roots of pine trees and fir trees. So it's similar to what's on there. We're trying to get the lignin and the cellulose off. Turpentine comes from that, and like dissolves like, right? The other reason I chose turpentine is because low pH or acidic solutions are very harsh to metals. When you think about it, really, when you apply acid to a metal, what happens is some sort of a reaction whereby the metal turns into a salt. So turpentine has a pH a little bit above the center, so it's like 8 or so, somewhere around there. Depends, of course, on the specific brand, I'm sure. But anyway, because it's not acidic, it's not going to be too hard on the blade. Now, of course, this is going to be quite messy, so wipe off any excess residue. Turpentine, of course, is an oil, and so it's not going to wipe off completely. It's not going to evaporate right away. So wipe them off thoroughly, and then give all the parts a good wash with soap and water. Just dish soap is fine. And here I'm throwing the hardware into turpentine as well, just to remove any gunk that's stuck on the hardware. So now we do check for any nicks, any damage. If anything feels like there's a sharp nick that might snag your finger when you're not expecting it, then this is the time to take a file and just smooth it out, which is what I'm doing here. Files are good for rough work. We're not going to use a file for sharpening when we get to that. We'll use diamond stones. Not that you have to use diamond specifically, but I like to when I can. Okay, moving on to the blade. I thought I'd mock this up in a 3D model first, because it'd be a little bit easier to explain. Here we have the back side of the blade. All right, you can see that there is no edge on this side, right? A shear blade is a chisel blade. In other words, it's only sharpened on one side. It's got a flat side, the back, which is what we're looking at just at this moment here. And then if we turn it, you can see it's sharpened only on one side. The reason I wanted to point out that flat back side is because the first thing we have to do is lap the blade. I'm going to take a fine credit card sized diamond stone here, and I'm just going to flatten the back side So all I'm doing here is running it back and forth so that the flat back side is indeed actually flat. What you can do now is wipe off all that swarf. And if you get it in the light, or if I get it in the light just right there, you can see how it's nice and clean now in certain areas. So that indicates that it's really not quite as flat as ideal. Now there is a trade-off, of course. You know, when you do this, I mean, you're grinding metal away, so you really have to keep in mind, you know, how perfect does it have to be, and at what expense am I making it perfect? You know, if I'm thinning the blade, then I'm obviously, to some extent, I'm going to reduce the life of the blade. But the majority of the blade is nice and shiny, indicating that it's getting hit by most of the stone, or the stone over most of the blade area, which indicates that it's actually relatively flat, and I'm going to stop there. All I'm doing here is I've got some 320 grit sandpaper, and because there's a black patina on this blade, I'm just going to give it a bit of a cleanup, just a bit of abrasion here to expose the bare stainless steel beneath and give it a bit of a shine. This technically doesn't really serve any utility. It just makes it look nice. It gives the user a feel that, wow, something's been done. Look at how nice and clean it is, right? It's got some shine to it. It's looking like metal again rather than just a black sort of dirty surface, right? Now I'm not going to go too far with it. I'm not going to scrub all the way until I get pure clean metal everywhere, because again, keep in mind, what are the trade-offs, right? When I do this, of course, what I'm doing is I'm stripping away metal to do this. So again, you have to sort of balance utility versus the consequence of what you're doing. So if we wipe that up, we can see now that it's quite a bit shinier than it was. It's got that nice gray silver metal color again. All right, now we're going to talk about sharpening the blade. So a chisel blade is, as we said earlier, flat on one side. So to the right, you can see the flat edge, and to the left, you can see the double bevel. Now, the one that's green right now, that's the only, not this one, that's the secondary bevel. That's the top of the blade. This one that's green right now, that's the only surface you want to sharpen. It's the micro bevel. Not every blade has a double bevel. Some blades only have a single bevel. But this, generally chisels will usually have two bevels. And it's the micro bevel, the first one, that you sharpen. If you look to the right, we're looking straight down at the blade here. If you look to the right, see how it's got two bevels? The flat side on the bottom, and then that secondary bevel that I'm touching right there, and then this. That's the only area you sharpen, that little first bevel. And you can see I've kind of rounded it a little bit in the diagram, just because that's what tends to happen, of course, when a blade gets dull, is it gets rounded over at the edge. Notice again that secondary bevel is much bigger than the micro bevel. That micro bevel is what gives it that sharp tip right here, this thing here. So you sharpen from that point right there to that point there. This is hard to explain on camera, and I also apologize, the shot's not centered. It's hard when you're working alone. Sometimes you make mistakes, or at least I did anyway. This is a diamond stone, it's a 300 grit. I find it very useful for sharpening curved blades because it's not a flat, it's not a square surface. If I were using a stone that were a brick shape, then it would be hard to follow that curve. The brick shape would want to flatten out that curved edge. Now here I've applied a little bit of wax to all the parts. This is just car wax. It happens to be turtle paste wax, doesn't have to be that brand. I apply wax because it's important to do whatever you can to minimize water from sitting on these. So it's impossible, even if you're diligent about cleaning them all the time. The bottom line is some dust and some moisture in the air is always going to be up against the metal. But if you can put a wax barrier on there, that helps a lot as far as preventing your shears from rusting. I've done this many, many times. I've volunteered as a tool sharpener numerous times. And I've had a lot of feedback from people, and they always seem to be quite happy when they come back and see me and say, "Oh, you did my shears last season. They were so much better," you know. So it's worth the time and effort. And we'll give them a test. And of course, this is a hardwood dowel. I think it's poplar. And of course, because it's dry, this is actually not really a fair test because twigs and branches are actually not going to be dry, and so they won't be nearly as difficult to cut. But that just goes to show how well they're working now. So that's that. And if you have any questions, put them in the comments. If there are other tools you have questions about, put those in the comments. Thanks, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.